Greetings! I'm Shad, and in this video I'm going to be describing what the individual qualities of a sword are that affect its use. So if we were to break down a sword and try and look at every single quality that affects its actual use, how it will perform, we would then not be really looking at other things, for instance, its appearance, how beautiful the sword is. And though that is a very important component in sword design, that's not what I'm going to be doing in this video. Specifically, we're going to look at functionality. So, what are the individual qualities that a sword has that affects its function? Now, you might think you actually know what the individual qualities of a sword is, like, its length, its size, its cutting capacity, and things like that. Well, that's all correct, but there's actually some finer, more specific and detailed things, as we really look at it, that need to be acknowledged, and also understood if you want to understand what makes a sword a good sword. So when I look at a sword and really kind of try and assess what these individual qualities are, these are the things that I see are very important to look at in regards to how this sword will perform. The first ones are kind of the broader aspects of the sword, so the overall size. So what we'll be looking at here is reach, okay, so length of the blade, reach. The next one is hand protection, how well your hands are protected when you're holding the sword. Next is point of balance, alright. Next, the type of steel that the sword is made from. Then the overall versatility of the sword, and so these are kind of the more broader things to assess when looking at a sword. Now let's go to the more specific qualities. For instance, the weight, the rigidity of the sword. Now, the main thing that will determine how rigid a sword will be the depth of the blade. And so when we're talking about length, width, and depth, the width and depth can sometimes get confused, and I know I've confused what those terms refer to. Is it referring to the width of the blade from edge to edge, or are you referring to the width of the blade from flat to flat? Well, the width of the blade from flat to flat, I now refer to as depth. So on a sword you'll have length, width, and depth, and it's the depth of a sword that will largely determine how rigid it is. And its rigidity is a very important factor to consider when looking at a sword. Next is the edge, bevel, angle, or degree. So looking at the angle of the edge bevel. And then lastly, the tip angle, its acuteness. So how fine and sharp or pointed that tip is. So going through the list again, it's reach, hand protection, point of balance, the type of steel, the overall versatility of the sword, its weight, its width or rigidity, the edge, bevel, angle or degree, and the tip angle or acuteness. So again, these are the qualities that come to mind when I really try and analyze a sword, like I said, and try and figure out what are the qualities that's going to affect how well this sword performs. That's the list. That's what comes to mind. If you feel I've missed something, please let me know in the comments. And on that note, coming to the end of editing this video, I've actually thought of 2 additional sword qualities that I should have really included, and that is the taper in a sword, and so that means the regular taper and also the distal taper, as well as curvature. And so unfortunately I've forgotten to include those 2 sword qualities, but I'm mentioning them now, and if you would like me to go into further detail as to how those 2 qualities, tapering and sword curvature, affects how a sword performs, I'll happily do a follow-up video where I cover those things. Now what I want to do is go through that list individually and explain why these things are important. Now some of these will be self-explanatory, and I'm sure many of you already know, and some of you might even know all the reasons why these individual things are important, but for those of you who don't, I'm going to go through and explain each of these qualities and why they are important in sword design. Beginning with reach. Reach, this is, again, a fairly easy one to understand, so I don't think I should need to go into too much detail, but simply put, if you have a longer sword that outreaches the length of your opponent's sword, you can go in and close the distance just enough for your sword to connect, and your opponent's sword will be too far away to connect with you, keeping you safe. And so if you have the reach advantage, that is a hugely significant advantage to you as a warrior, soldier, or whatever. And if you've ever trained with swords, fought with swords and everything like that, against someone who has a reach advantage against you, you will know firsthand how difficult that is to deal with. And I know, because I'm speaking from experience here, that it is really hard to work around. So simply put, the more reach a sword has, the more effective it will be. Now, it doesn't mean that reach is the ultimate thing. All these things will come into play. For instance, increasing the reach of a sword will also make it heavier. Therefore, there comes a point where extending its length too far becomes totally impractical. Next up, hand protection. Hand protection is really interesting when you look at it, because depending on the type of hand protection or the level of hand protection you have on a sword, that really determines your stance or how you will hold the sword in combat. Swords that have a lot of hand protection, where, if it's a fully swept hilt or basket hilt, well, with swords like that, they are held completely forward facing the opponent. The hand holding it is extended all the way, whereas the stances that you would need to adopt if you don't have that hand protection, you need to keep the hand back, generally almost at your body or behind, to protect your hand, because if it doesn't have the protection, the hand is a horrendously vulnerable part in sword combat. Now, of course, hand protection will have other effects if you add it onto a sword, because the more hand protection you add, the more weight you will also be adding to the sword. And it also affects versatility. See, we're going to come down to versatility, because that's important. Because when you put extra hand protection on, you generally restrict the sword to only be using a primary edge. You can't turn it around and have any edge become the true edge or false edge. It basically makes a single one of the edges on the sword the dedicated true edge, because say if you get a knuckle bow on a sword or anything like that, you are then defining what is the permanent true edge of a sword and the false edge, and that will actually reduce its versatility. Still, generally, the more hand protection, the better the sword, but there is a lot of pros and cons in regards to this point, or this specific sword quality. Alright, point of balance. Now, point of balance is again one of those things that has pros and cons, because a point of balance that is close to the hand will increase the rate in which you can redirect the momentum of the sword, and also improve your point control. And so when I say point control, I'm actually referring to the tip of the sword. But that doesn't mean that a higher point of balance, meaning a point of balance that is further away from your hand, that doesn't mean that is necessarily a bad thing. Because if you have a point of balance that's further down the blade, well, that will actually increase cutting capacity. Think of an axe. An axe is basically, it's absolutely top heavy. All the weight is at the top of, the weapon, which creates a lot of driving force. There's a reason why we chop down trees with axes. Now, having said that, there is a misconception to think that if the point of balance is all the way down and even close to your hand, say if you were to hold an axe upside down, you would feel no driving force on the other end. Now, that is true, but also it can lead to a misconception. And that is, in reversing the axe, you're reversing the weight. But what if you added weight to an axe's handle? So you're not taking away any weight from the top of the weapon, you're just adding extra weight to the bottom of the weapon to bring down that point of balance. Now, this will be making a heavier weapon overall, but as I really think about it, and it's only something that I've been forced to think about more since doing a video that I just uploaded previously, this one, in comparing the difference between a sword that has a crossguard compared to a sword that has a swept hilt, and how that would affect cutting capacity. And my conclusion, as I've really thought about it, is that if there is the same level of mass in the blade, regardless of the point of balance is lowered, if the same mass and weight is in the blade, that should actually maintain its cutting capacity. It might lower it the slightest amount, but it's not going to be like grabbing an axe and reversing it and holding it by the axe head, because the weight is still there. So these are my thoughts on point of balance. Point of balance is a really sophisticated and interesting thing to analyze and think about. Okay, type of steel. Oh my goodness, look, I don't want to spend too much time on this, because the type of steel can be gloriously sophisticated and interesting, which means it can take a lot of time to go into. And if you want to a more in-depth kind of analysis or look at the type of steel, I suggest you watch my katana series, specifically The Truth About the Katana, Part 4, differential hardening, because in that video I talk about differential hardening versus mono steel, spring steel versus hardened steel, and that has all the detail there. And through a very in-depth analysis of it all, I come to the conclusion in that video that I personally feel spring steel has an edge over hardened steel in that it's more durable. Now, like if you look at a sword that is made out of hardened steel, so it's like tool steel equivalent, and this means it doesn't have much flex, okay? So a steel this strong will snap, and in regard to the katana though, it's only the very edge that's so hard and the rest is soft, and so I won't go into that. But if the whole thing was hardened to steel, and you can find swords like that on the market, they will snap, but it'll take a lot of force for them to snap, but a spring steel sword will actually be able to withstand the level of force that would cause a hardened steel sword to snap. A spring steel sword will take that flex and then flex back. So in my opinion, they're more durable, but they won't hold an edge for longer. It's a myth that hardened steel swords can become sharper than spring steel swords. You can get a soft steel and make it easily as sharp as a hardened steel one. It just means it won't retain that sharpness for as long, nearly as long, especially if it's soft. So the harder the sword, the longer it will retain an edge. Doesn't mean it can be sharper. You can make anything as sharp as anything. So yes, this is all very important in determining how effective a sword will be, and in my opinion, spring steel is the bee's knees. It's the best. Now we are up to versatility. This is an interesting thing, and I almost didn't realize how important it was when I was trying to look at these different qualities of a sword that determines how effective it is. But when I realized it, I was feeling like an idiot. But of course, this is a very important part, because the more that you can use the sword in different ways, the better a weapon it is. And so if the sword can only cut, okay, and you can't thrust with it or use it in any other way, and I'll get to the other ways, and I'm sure you're already thinking of them, then the sword, of course, is a much more ineffective weapon. But of course, if you can thrust as well as cut, that covers a few more bases. But what about if that doesn't even work? Because the way that a sword is structured, swords don't have huge amounts of mass in the blade. They can, of course, I'll correct that. But they'll never have as much mass as, say, an axe, or a poleaxe, or a halberd, or anything like that. That's what I meant when they can't have huge amounts of mass. But of course, they can get huge amounts of mass, just not as much as other weapons. And swords will have a disadvantage in that. And so, is there a way that you can use certain types of swords where they will become more effective when you need more driving force? Well, of course there is. Swords that have cross guards, you can strike with the cross guard, and that can be far more effective against opponents in armor than striking with the blade. And then, of course, we come to the pummel. Clearly, in Europe, the pummel was actually far more effective and devastating than many of us might have thought. Where do you think the term pummel someone comes from? I do actually feel, though it's impossible to prove this, but I do feel that it seems like it makes sense to come from the pummel of a sword, because striking with the pummel is a very significant and powerful thing you can do with a sword, if it has a pummel that you can strike with. As we all know, if you want to end thine opponent rightly, the pummel is where it is. Because you throw it, of course. Of course. So, versatility is actually a very significant component for a sword. Can you strike with a pummel? Does it even have a pummel? And then can you strike with it? And, of course, even more importantly, can you unscrew that pummel and throw it? That's a necessity! And if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's your loss. Can you strike with the crossguard? Okay, these are all very important things. And the more versatile a sword is, of course, in my opinion, the more effective a sword it is. Now we're going to come to some more specific qualities of a sword, and these ones generally can be overlooked when you look at a sword, so we're not going to do that. Let's have a look at them. Weight, of course, I already really covered this in point of balance, because point of balance is directly tied to weight. And a heavier sword will generally, it has the potential to cut more effectively than other types of swords, but of course, if a sword is heavy and not sharp and has terrible edge bevel or anything like that, it can be a horrible cutter. So, of course, this isn't the only quality, but if all the other bases or boxes are ticked, the weight can then really increase its cutting capacity. In my opinion, speed trumps weight and cutting capacity, especially if the sword can cut well enough. If the sword does adequate enough cuts, you don't need to increase its weight to make it have devastating cuts. If you can find a way for a sword to be really good at cutting and thrusting, and then have it as light as possible, that's what you want. So it's really a matter of finding what works for the individual, but if you want it to be good at all these other qualities, you don't want to overdo the weight. The next quality that is very, very important to how well a sword will perform will be its rigidity. And this becomes very important when you consider edge alignment, alright? If the sword is not rigid, it's capable of flexing, everything like that. If you strike with a sword and its edge alignment is off, meaning the angle or position of the blade is not in line with the motion that the sword is traveling with, when it strikes something, a lot of that force in the cut, okay, can actually be misdirected into the flex of the sword, because there's no even transfer if the angle is off. If the angle is true, the transferal force will be perfect from the sword into the target and you'll get a clean cut. So the way that a sword can actually resist a lot of this incorrect force transfer or misdirected of force is if it is naturally stiff and rigid, because if it is stiff and rigid, it will try and push back, okay, the force that is getting thrown off the cut, put into the blade. If the blade is stiff and rigid, it'll hold and resist that and then push it back into the thing and into the whatever you're cutting into, and that will still make it a good effective cut. Sorry, an adequate enough cut. And indeed, if it is really rigid as well, as soon as that edge digs into the material, if the sword is more stiff and rigid, it will then try and correct the angle and it'll then cut through. Interesting thing, the more rigid a sword, the better, but what we have a problem here is the thing that we can do to make a sword more rigid. If we make it out of more stiffer steel, alright, it will have less flex when it needs to flex, okay? So when you're cutting, you actually don't really want the sword to flex too much if you want it to be forgiving in the cut. But when the sword gets punished or beaten at a wrong angle, you want it to flex to absorb the shock away from the sword snapping. So we're seeing another kind of exchange here. And the way that you answer that is that you want it to be the sword to be as flexible as possible, but the amount of force it needs to make that sword flex to be very, very high, which actually means the sword will be very, very rigid, but it's still capable of flexing, okay? So basically, you want the flex to be far more resistive in a sword, but even when it's pushed to that extreme to where it will flex, you want it to be able to flex to a really huge degree. And that is the answer in regards to rigidity versus the flexibility of the sword. The other way to increase the rigidity of a sword, and this can be done in a sword that actually has no flex, and of course we're talking about the type of steel when we're talking about springs and flex and stuff. The other way is by making the sword deeper. So remember in those angles that we talked about, length, width, and depth, you will widen the depth, okay? So increase the depth of the sword. That will make it more rigid. The disadvantage that will come in regards to this, and we talked about it just in weight, is that if a sword is deeper, it needs to push more material aside to allow the blade to move into the material. So whatever you're cutting into, a wider sword has to push more, material to the sides to allow it to pass in, which creates more resistance. And that will reduce the severity of the cuts of a sword. And so, if you could make like the perfect sword in the world, you would want it as thin as possible, as rigid as possible, as flexible as possible, but only after it can resist huge amounts of stress and remain rigid. And then you technically would want it as thin as possible and as sharp as possible. Of course, with the current materials that we make swords out of, that's impossible. There's so much exchange in these qualities in regards to steel, because if you make a sword thinner, you will reduce rigidity. It's just how it works. Even though a sword that is like, paper thin would technically be incredible if it could just remain in its shape. Because again, if it's that thin, that reduces the amount of force or weight you need behind the sword for it to cut effectively. Essentially, if you could make this ultimate sword that is light as a feather, thinner than paper, more rigid than an I-beam, and more flexible than a bow, you'd have the ultimate sword that would barely need any force to do the most devastating of cuts you could ever imagine. But like I said, in regards to steel, it's a different thing. It's a give and take kind of battle, and you need to find the right balance, okay? And this is the interesting thing when you look at a sword and look at its qualities. You will need to assess how deep it is, how heavy it is, how rigid it is, and of course how sharp it is. And so this will then bring us to the angle of the edge, okay? How acute and sharp the degree of the edge is. And this, of course, only affects the cutting side of a sword, but it's the same kind of thing when we get to the tip, okay? The more acute the edge bevel can be, and again, the more acute the tip will be, okay, the more effective a sword will be able to cut and also thrust. Looking at the edge specifically in regards to cutting. This is a very tricky give and take kind of relationship, because the more shallow you make that angle of the edge, okay, the thinner the sword will be. And we talked about the pros and cons of having a thin sword. If there was a way to make the sword really rigid, yet still flexible enough, and have it be thin, that would be awesome. But we can't do that with steel. Steel doesn't work that way. And so the way that you can add rigidity and therefore have a sword be forgiving in the cut is by increasing its depth, okay? And the drawback of increasing its depth then means the angle of the edge will not be nearly as acute. And of course that means it can't be as sharp as it could have been, and therefore won't cut as effectively as it could have. But remember, again, you've heard me say this a lot, it's a give and take. Because even though it can't be as sharp, like I said, it will be more rigid, therefore more forgiving in the cut. And so it could, to just casual observation, it could seem to be cutting just as well, or easier in fact. Another way to increase the acuteness of the edge of a sword, so this means the angle of the edge of the sword being much lower in degree, is to increase the width of the sword. Remember, length, width, depth, we're talking about width now. If you widen the sword, you can actually reduce the angle quite considerably, and this is the exact design principle behind many types of falchion. Why do you think they widened that part of the blade so much? It was to reduce the angle of the sword's edge, okay? The bevel, it's reducing that. The wider you make it, the smaller you can make the degree of the angle, and therefore make a much sharper sword. So yes, you could keep the depth of the sword and just increase the width at certain points, and then increase cutting capacity by a very large degree. And it should technically be as rigid as it was before, or so close that you wouldn't even notice the difference. There is a drawback to widening a blade so much, and that will make the edge, like the edge of the sword, because it is getting so thin at that edge, when it's so wide like that, it will make the edge far more fragile. And so if you wanted a sword to be more durable, alright, having a thicker edge angle can be a good thing, and or indeed even an important thing. It wouldn't be able to cut as well, but it would retain its edge for longer and be more durable throughout its use. I just find this so interesting. It's all, like, again, all these give and take qualities. And a lot of what we've been talking about, of course, affects the next quality and the last quality we will look at. The tip of the sword. Specifically, how, fine or acute that tip is. It has a lot in relation to what we talked about in regards to the edge, because the lower the angle on the tip means the thinner the sword will be towards that end of the blade. And if a sword is thinner towards the top, meaning not just in point of balance but also in mass, it'll cut far less effectively towards the tip of the sword than not lower down. But it's at the tip where the most momentum can be generated when swinging the sword because of the length. And so if you want, the most devastating cut you can get, you would want it closer towards the top of the sword because the momentum is so much higher when swinging. But if there's low mass towards that end of the sword, that will really detract away from its cutting ability. Now, it doesn't mean the sword won't be able to cut well, it just means you would have to be far closer to your opponent to cut or to strike them at the portion of the blade that's capable of still doing good cuts, because the more acute and, fine that tip is, the less effective the tip will cut. Now, of course, the next part, which goes without saying, is that it'll be far more effective at thrusting. And this comes into the classic analysis between thrusting and cutting and which is better and stuff like that. And I talk about that a bit in my video, Super Cutting Swords, Are They Needed? If you're interested, have a look. But what you might find even more interesting is the comments to that video, because it's in the comments that I've found people have really looked at the pros and cons between cutting and thrusting. Some very insightful things to read there. See how sophisticated this is? It's just awesome. I find it so interesting. And there we have it. There you go. Those are the breakdowns of a sword's quality in the parts of the sword, or the qualities of the sword, that affects its use, how effective it will be as a sword. And they were reach, hand protection, points of balance, the type of steel, the versatility of the sword itself, the weight of the sword, the rigidity of the sword, angle of the edge bevel on the sword, and also the angle of the tip of the sword, and we looked at how width and depth both affect these things in a big way. Thank you very much for watching, I hope you've enjoyed, and until next time, farewell.